like to say thank you very much for inviting me to talk here today. I've worked with Forum for the Future for the last 6 years, and mostly been working with English and Welsh authorities. I've done a trip to Belfast before, but this is the first time I've been able to really come back to Ireland to talk about sustainability issues. And I think I've always sort of observed what's happening in Ireland and taken a personal interest in what's going on there. So for me, it's just really exciting to see this number of people together representing a range of organisations willing to come together today to talk about sustainability issues. I just want to say a bit about the organisation that I work for. I'm going to talk a bit about Forum, talked a bit about the Sustainable Cities Index that we've been developed, and also refer to work that's been going on in the US, and talk about a particular project we've been pushing forward in Bristol about trying to create a sustainable city, and what our experiences have been, and how that has worked. So just a bit about Forum for the Future. We were established about 12 years ago. We call ourselves the leading sustainable development charity in the UK. We were set up by sort of 3 leading lights in the sustainable development field at that time, and still currently. Jonathan Porritt, who was mentioned earlier, and who was also chair of the Sustainable Development Commission in the UK, which was set up when Tony Blair came to power. Sarah Parkin, who's been a leading light in the Green Party within the UK, and also Paul Eakins, who's a prominent environmental economist. The reason Forum was established, it was felt at the time that there was a lot of negativity around the environmental agenda. So there was a lot of pointing the finger saying, you must do this, you must do that, you're not taking action. And a lack of actually organisations, our charities willing to work with organisations, work with businesses, public sector organisations to say, okay, well, these are the challenges you face, and this is how you can do it. We will work with you to explore how actually this can be achieved. So for the last 12 years, we've been working with public sector organisations and businesses, looking at the challenges they face, but really, trying to develop much more practical solutions of how they can address this agenda. And of course, over this time, we've seen an immense shift. Just even over the last 5 years, we'd still be 5 years ago really talking and explaining to businesses and public sector organisations why they should take this agenda seriously. Whereas now it's moved on a bit more, in that it's a lot less of trying to convince them. It's much more explaining, well, how you can actually do this. A lot more organisations, both businesses and public sector organisations, realise they need to take this agenda much more seriously, and it's the how we can actually do this that's important. These are a selection of the organisations, the businesses that we currently work with, so represent a range of sectors, from Vodafone, from transport organisations to financial organisations, a lot of retail sector organisations, and ones you might expect to see there, such as Virgin Atlantic. A lot of public sector organisations as well, a lot of local authorities, regional organisations, Welsh Assembly Government, across the board in the UK. Two things I want to talk about. One, I want to talk about the Sustainable Cities Index that we've been developing, which has really been to look at cities within the UK and see how they are performing. So drawn from what the US had been doing, and I'll speak about them in a minute, we looked at, based on some population data, which were the largest cities within the UK and how they rank in terms of what actions they were taking on sustainable development. The only obvious omission, which would have been interesting here, is Belfast, and that was really to do with just a lack of comparable data with cities in England, Scotland and Wales, so that's the only reason they weren't able to be included. So we looked at them across a range of different indicators. We sort of took 3 baskets of areas. One was environmental indicators, areas such as air quality, river water quality, ecological footprint, waste, quality of life and future proofing. We feel we needed a sort of a balanced set to see what really their progress was towards sustainability. Focusing on the environmental one alone would have told us that actually we might have ended up, research had said we might end up being biased towards less affluence area, and also wouldn't give us a real sense of what it was actually like to live in that area. And that's why we've used much more as well quality of life indicators, and probably interesting future proofing indicators, which was to give an indication of how they were planning for the future. So for instance, local authority commitments on climate change, we would have looked at it. Do they have a published climate change strategy? then if they do, have they actually got dedicated resources to implement that? And have they actually also got a target on emissions that at least meets the government targets, but really more exceeds government targets on reducing their emissions? Green business was more the number of green business that were in the locality based on information available on yale.com, and then recycling rates and sort of areas that were contributing towards biodiversity. So most of this was publicly available data that could be compared across cities. So what did we find out? Unfortunately, these results are from 2007. The 2008 data is going to be published on Monday, and I've been embargoed to talk about it before then. But what I can probably say is that there hasn't been a huge amount of shifts, as you might expect over a year. And I will explain that where there has been shifts, why it has, without necessarily saying who came top. But what we found is that Brighton and Hove came out top. And they really came out strong on their quality of life indicators. They really came out strong on sort of future-proofing and showing that the actions that they were taking. Likewise, Edinburgh and Bristol. But Brighton and Hove scored a lot less well in terms of their environmental indicators. At the other end of the board, you have places like Hull, Birmingham and Liverpool who performed less well, who might have, say for Liverpool, performed a bit more strongly in some environmental indicators, but in terms of sort of future-proofing and analysing their commitment to climate change, the information wasn't there, we couldn't see what was taking place. I suppose no city performed well across the board. Like I said, Brighton and Hove came out top, but still on environmental indicators, they were still performing poorly. The ones that you might expect, more service-based economies, did better, rather than those that had really a strong industrial heritage. And certainly those cities that were based in the Midlands, Birmingham, Coventry, Wolverhampton, you find them much more at sort of the lower end of the index. Affluence helps, it also linked to that service economy, but all the cities which are in the more affluent area of the UK, the southern area, the southeast, they've all come out better. So 2008, the data will be available on Monday for those of you who will be interested to see it, but there hasn't been huge, great changes that you might expect over the course of 1 year, because a lot of these are really big issues that people will need to grapple with. Well, there has been some changes. They've been, very much in terms of actions that the local authority could take. So, for instance, such as publishing the climate change strategy, dedicating resources to making sure it's being implemented and setting targets. Those sort of things councils have been able to do in a year, and that has helped move some of them sort of up the rankings in terms of how they're performing. I think it's also interesting to look at a similar work that's been going on in the US, and of course look at what's number one, Portland, Oregon, which we've already just discussed and Carl Henrik mentioned in his presentation. They have been doing this ranking and rating for sort of slightly longer than we have. They have sort of 3 years of information. And we've already heard about the initiative that businesses are taking as regards Portland, but also what the manager and the mayor has said, that Portland are also seeing the impact now of policies that they started to take in the 70s, which maybe gives an indication of how long as well they have been planning and just how long sometimes some of these things take. On the other hand, you have Mesa, Arizona, which it actually says is the largest city that no one's ever heard of, and this was even in the States, so I didn't feel so bad for not have actually heard of Mesa before. But on about 45, we had, for instance, Colorado Springs, which is much more associated with positive environment, but actually still had figures like 80% of people travelled in a car to where their place of employment was, and they were the only occupant in that car. I suppose contrast that, Portland, Oregon, who have an aspiration for it to take no more than 20 minutes for anybody to get to their work by public transport, or ideally by walking or cycling. So I suppose we started to use this index in the UK really to engender competition among cities to say, look, how are you doing? Look at these areas. These areas, you could be developing further. And we're not saying by any stretch of the imagination this is, the perfect index or the best information. We obviously used information that was available that we could use to compare. But really it was to promote the conversation amongst these cities about, look, how are you doing? Look at how other cities are doing. Can you do better? And I suppose, looking at the US index and, the UK index, it'd be just interesting to think, if the information was collected for Dublin, where do you think Dublin would come in the rankings? And obviously, but you can look at the US information is available on sustainlane.com. They're the organisation who do it in the US, and the information on the UK one is available, so you can look much more in detail. But it's just an interesting question to ask about where would Dublin come, and these, if you want to be sort of the leading, city in terms of the world, these are the ones you're sort of looking towards. Just to mention about, in terms of how system, I'm sorry that isn't so clear, but the basic concept is, those places that are actually, and it applies to companies and public sector organisations and organisations coming together as well, is that idea of is sustainability an add-on, or is it actually intrinsic to what an organisation is doing? Over the last number of years, I've looked at several different strategies, be it planning, transport, and just how sustainability is integrated. And often, if I get a strategy later on to comment on, it's usually too late, because actually it needs to be embedded right from the beginning. So you can't just add it on. It really needs to be sort of fundamental to how that organisation works, be it the city as a whole, be it a public sector organisation, be it a private sector organisation. So that's what that very fuzzy diagram is trying to say. So I wanted to talk about a practical project, because it was all very well us producing this index, again saying this is how cities are doing, this is how you could be doing better, but how could we actually do it in practice with the city? And we had a lot of conversations about, it wasn't as obvious to us. You're here in Dublin, obviously you're talking about Dublin. We're a charity based across the UK, so for us it was a question of, where would we try and help create a sustainable city? And also we started off with what was the scale? Actually, would we be better off focusing on a market town, a bit smaller, maybe easier to take things forward? But in the end, we came to the conclusion that actually the city was the right scale, that that's where we could make things happen, and that's what would have the impact, but would also lead other places, because if you could do it in a larger places, then you can do it in a smaller place as well. We weren't trying to start with a city that had actually no record of anything being achieved. We were starting with a city that already had very strong, sort of particularly NGO community there, who were trying to get things done on the ground, but really in a real disparate manner. And it was trying to really to sort of bring that together and harness that energy and bring those organisations to create a much bigger picture rather than just separate initiatives going on. So we very much talked to these organisations, looked to see what was actually happening on the ground, and then tried to see, okay, well, where were the gaps? And then after that came out of, okay, well, what are the areas that we need to work on? Mapping and visioning started off, and the mapping was finding out obviously what was going on and where there appeared to be gaps. But the visioning, it's obviously the critical side, which is saying, okay, well, you can't just start the initiative, you need to know where you're actually going. And obviously Karl Heinrich has already been talking about that. You have to have an idea of where you're heading, because that is always inbuilt. For Dublin City Council, whoever, always have a plan. So there's obviously already an inherent vision. But but it's making that a bit more explicit, and then seeing, is that the correct vision? Is that the one you actually want to achieve? I think when we talked to some leaders of some of these cities as part of the new index we're publishing, and one of them said, well, the problem with a lot of visions is, does it pass the TIPEX test? Could you scratch out one city and write in another, and actually it would look the same, because it's so bland, it's not really saying anything. It doesn't really mean anything to that city itself. So, is it a vision that really means something and can be, is ambitious enough and can be achievable? And then we broke down, particular areas that needed to be addressed. And these were, particular to Bristol. These were the challenges that Bristol had that needs to be addressed. So for one was around the local food systems, how you actually link up local producers with local businesses who were trying to sell. Because we're feeling there were a lot of local producers, there were businesses who were interested in maybe selling more local products. But again, it was a lot of initiatives ongoing. It was in more, and so this produced into East West campaign for Bristol that is bringing these organisations together. So there was really, recognising that there was good soil association who are promoting organic food are based in Bristol, so we could draw on the expertise of organisations that were already there. So I think for Forum, we're not saying, well, we have the expertise on food, on transport and housing, but it's really building on those organisations that are already there in Bristol and doing things. I mentioned about sustainable mobility in a minute. Carbon Challenge was really about how we could get both businesses and public sector organisations, Bristol as a whole, to reduce their emissions. So reduce by at least 60% if not 80%. And I suppose that is a key thing. Is it isn't just the public sector organisations. That needs to be something that businesses as well across the whole region are addressing. The sustainability literacy was based on the central idea of behavioural change. So there's a lot of different messages coming through to consumers in Bristol about you must do this, you must do this. And the people themselves were getting confused about what they were actually supposed to do. What was more important for them to do? Was it around energy or water? So this is trying to see, well, can we bring all these messages together to present something more coherent that people can understand, and by the sum of its part produce something much greater with a greater impact. And the built environment I'll also just mention in a moment. The built environment, I suppose, there's been a lot of talk in the UK about new houses and new developments, and how you could create more sustainable buildings that were just being built. But actually, 23% of carbon emissions in the UK are from existing buildings, existing homes. So retrofitting and how to deal with the existing housing stock was really sort of the elephant in the room, how we were really going to tackle that. And that is sort of one of the areas. So we have a target for retrofitting around 1,000 homes over the next 3 years. But, I suppose this is, the initial scoping. That literally started off with, this is the gap, this is what's already happening. And then try to map everything that actually needs to happen. And, anybody's trying to implement a project on the ground, the immensity of just trying to do that. You're talking about, are there people there who actually can carry it out locally, the skills available, what are the skills that we actually need? Then, how are we going to get consumers on board, the behavioural change aspects of it? And then, what is the funding mechanism? This isn't something that's just going to be probably presented to consumers. The money isn't there. So what sort of funding or loan system could be developed to try and actually make this happen? And sort of ended up with a whole huge range of areas. So it's trying to break that down and to bring it forward to see how this can happen. Sustainable mobility was one of the big problems for Bristol is transport. And sort of the new cities index, for a lot of those cities that were at the top, like Bristol, and those were lower down, like Liverpool, we asked people what it was like to live in those areas. And what's always interesting, even if it's at the top of the index or the bottom of the index, you'll get positive and you'll get negative. So Bristol close to the top, great place, loads of green spaces, somebody else saying, yeah, transport's rubbish, I can't get anywhere. Whereas at the bottom of the index, you'll have somebody saying something negative around living in Liverpool, but at the same time saying, we all know about the pride people in Liverpool have about living there, and it's expressing that as well. So anecdotally you could get both sides. I suppose one of the things we just wanted to do straight away was to launch something. What we launched was a website called KoolKat.com, which is started off in London by a guy who said, well, I just see people jumping into taxis in London, and I know they're only going around the corner, or I see them getting on the tube, and I know they could actually walk there. So you key in you're arriving in Paddington, and you want to go to High Park Corner, and this would present a map of how you could actually walk there. And it's sort of, revelationary, really, when you look at it and you think, wow, I didn't realise that was only 15 minutes away, rather than spending 45 minutes in the tube. So that was launched for Bristol as something that could happen straight away, and that happened with the support of, NGO that was based within Bristol, with a business on board, Tridos Bank, and with the council. So to make this happen, there were several organisations that came together to support it. On the ICT side, one of the big partners we have in Bristol is Hewlett-Packard, and that's looking at, well, can we present real-time information in terms of access to public transport for people who are living in Bristol that they can get onto their mobile phones? And then the promotion of we did a study a few years ago looking at transport needs within Bristol and brought together public and private sector organisations to say what are the challenges, and how we can address this collectively. And one of the things that came out of that was the need for the smart card. And a few years later, they'd still sort of struggle with this idea of how to make it happen. So they said, okay, well, we need somebody independent like Forum to come along and help make this happen and bring all the sort of different councils, because it wasn't just Bristol Council. There were 4 different councils in the greater Bristol area that need to be brought together to make this happen, along with businesses in terms of the technology and the need to make it happen, and also the people who use it in terms of the employees. So what are just some of the lessons, you know, about how, you know, going from this idea to trying to really make something happen? And of course, I can't really sit here and say, well, you know, we've created brilliant outcomes. I think what I'm trying to describe is a process of going from the idea to really, you know, getting things going and moving. What if it is really, you know, building and adding to what's there? You know, what is already happening? You know, who are, you know, what are the public sector organisations? What are the private sector organisations? What are the community NGO organisations? What's already going on, and how can you build on that and make it something bigger? Cross-sectoral engagement. This isn't the first initiative that tried to happen in Bristol, but I think a key thing for this was previously businesses hadn't really been engaged in initiatives that had happened within Bristol. So a critical thing was identifying and getting businesses involved. And that has happened both in terms of sort of businesses' interest in making individual projects happening. You know, for instance, Hewlett-Packard interested in sort of IT sort of based solutions. And also individual businesses who were sort of sitting on our steering group, you know, lending their support and trying to drive it forward. Obviously, there's the resource question. We've, you know, there's a foundation based in Bristol who's helped in terms of just creating the funding for a core post that has just tried to drive this forward. But individual projects, like I said, are happening through a mixture of businesses, NGOs, and private and public sector organisations and NGOs. But there is that need for the resources of how you're going to make this happen. I was going to say, for us, high-profile endorsement, we had Jonathan Parrott, who's, you know, really well known in the UK field in terms of sustainable development. And I suppose we were going into Bristol sort of fresh, even though we people then based on the ground. But, you know, he gave us that credibility in terms of what the messages we were communicating. And even, you know, recently I looked at something for Brighton, and the message it portrayed of somebody, you know, was now, you know, a leading businessman that was now taking, you know, the bus to work or was cycling. And it was that message that was conveyed, you know, that, and it's important to have that lead from not just sort of the public sector organisation, but also the private and community-based, because there can be the tendency otherwise for, you know, businesses to point the finger and say, well, we would do it, but really the council isn't doing anything. Public, the similar, you know, point to the council, well, they're not doing it, so we're not doing it. Whereas if you've got, at least if you've got everybody on board, there, you know, you can't just point the finger and say, well, nobody else is doing it, why should we? They're the organisations who are involved. A lot of them are sort of Bristol-based organisations. The universities based in the area, businesses, and the local authorities in the area have all supported it. So very much based around Bristol. So I think that's it. I mean, well, one thing I was just saying to John beforehand was, when I looked at the list of attendees here, I was like, wow, what an amazing selection of different organisations and people. I said it would be absolutely so impossible if we started off, and when we started off the initiative in Bristol, to get the same group of people together. Where, you know, it was very much based around going around talking to those organisations individually. I think had we just started off and sent a general invite around, we just wouldn't have got the same sort of group of people that you've actually managed to get here today. So I suppose, with the people who are in the room, actually creating a sustainable Dublin can happen just from simply, you know, harnessing the energy of the people collective here in this room. So, you know, I hope it goes forward. Okay, thank you.